The Canadian wilderness is an eerie place to be sure. The isolation, the cold, the bears. But what if I told you that something or someone roamed the area long ago? Someone who could survive easily in the chilling temperatures, who didn't hesitate to kill, and whose identity is still unknown to this day. Find out how a report for a small trapping violation led to a 48-day, 240-kilometer manhunt through the Arctic tundra. This is gonna be a good one. It's Christmas, 1931, and the RCMP, or Royal Canadian Mounted Police, are receiving various complaints that a strange man is messing with trap lines out in Yukon. Trap lines are like a route that trappers rig their traps in. The man was believed to be Albert Johnson, an odd individual who had recently moved into Rat River, the same area where the trap lines were being interfered with. This guy was weird. Crazy weird. No one knew if he even had any family, possessions, or where he came from. To want to live out near Rat River, though? That is strange. 3 days after the complaints were made, Constables Alfred King and Joe Bernard were sent down to the cabin to ask Albert a few questions, but upon knocking, the man didn't open the door or even respond to them. Because he was unresponsive, the two constables were forced to travel 128 kilometers back to Aklavik to get a search warrant. Keep in mind, these two have expressed no hostility towards Albert. They just want to know if he was messing with other trappers. A few days later, on December 31st, King and Bernard came back to the cabin with 2 additional constables to see if they could get anything out of the grizzly man. However, as soon as King knocked, Albert freaking got a shotgun and shot it through the door, penetrating King's chest and severely wounding him. The other officers opened fire while slowly moving back and getting King in a dog sled and running him out of there. At this point, it was pretty apparent to the Mounties that Albert Johnson was an incredibly dangerous individual to have around this area, and he needed to be dealt with. They were going back again, but this time they weren't messing around. Albert Johnson had shot a police officer, obviously with the intent to kill. And so, Inspector Alexander Eames led a party of 8 men back to Rat River in order to bring this psycho to justice. Upon arrival on January 9th, Alexander saw that Johnson had fortified the cabin. He reinforced the roof with a few extra layers of wood, and he made small little holes around the walls of the cabin so he could shoot out without having to leave. Armed with rifles, the police spread out in front of the house. Alexander yelled for Johnson to surrender, but we both know that didn't happen. Johnson reacted to the Mounties' words with sudden and non-stop gunfire. The police held their ground, shooting into the cabin, but to no avail. The walls were made of tightly packed logs, effectively making the bastion bulletproof. The officers tried to storm the cabin multiple times, but were held back by the madman's continued rain of fire. Johnson had a rifle and shotgun, both of which he used excessively as the shootout continued. Now should be a good time to mention that the entirety of this battle was fought in negative 45 degrees. That's cold. In one last attempt to bring Johnson down, the posse chucked dynamite onto the roof, decimating the top of the cabin and partially collapsing it. Somehow, Johnson survived this unscathed and just continued to shoot. This wasn't going anywhere, and after 3 days of this insane fight, food supplies were running very low for the officers, so Alexander Eames decided they should retreat and come back later. On January 14th, Constable Millen and another officer went back to the cabin and found it completely abandoned. Johnson's tracks had been covered by the snowfall. The RCMP was tasked with searching for Johnson over a 260 square kilometer region of blinding white tundra. The area was bordered by the Mackenzie River on the east and the Richardson Mountains on the west. The search party consisted of 18 people. It was led by Alexander Eames and had 4 officers from the previous shootout, including Millen. 2 sergeants were also deployed, as well as 11 First Nations trackers. On February 1st, the party was still searching for this guy, any trail to be found. However, supplies were running low, and so Alexander Eames and much of the posse went to go get new ones, leaving Constable Millen and 4 other men, 3 of them being RCMP officers and 1 of them being a First Nations tracker. The snow became much more treacherous as Millen's small group made their way across the never-ending tundra. The intermediate snowfall made it almost impossible to pick up any sort of trail, and just surviving in these conditions was hard enough. While searching, one of the trackers reported to Millen that he heard a gunshot coming from the Bear River area. Suspecting this had to be Johnson, Millen led the group towards the noise. After hours of hiking through icy fields, Millen saw something in the distance, and as the moon rose over the tundra, he realized it was, in fact, Albert Johnson. The group quickly caught up to the convict and cornered him in front of a tall glacial wall. Millen bravely stepped forward and demanded he surrender. Rather than giving up, Johnson began firing his rifle quickly at the men, backing up to the cliff wall as he did so. Millen and the others fought valiantly, but the trapper was a man of insane skill. Johnson shot a bullet straight through Millen's heart, and as the others looked at their dead leader in horror, Albert turned around to the cliff wall and began to climb. He somehow made it up an almost vertical climb of 30 feet while carrying his backpack and a rifle. Upon hearing about the second encounter with Johnson and the loss of Millen, Alexander was done. He requested the use of an airplane to help track Johnson and hopefully stop him once and for all. Soon after this, a bush pilot named Wilfred Whop May was on the scene. From this point on, Whop became a vital asset to the scene, not only scouring the area for Johnson, but also carrying Mounties to different strategic locations throughout the manhunt. Along with the airplane, many more officers were deployed into the mission, several ground patrols searching for Johnson at all times. After many days of surviving the intense cold, a huge blizzard came that grounded Whop's plane and forced all ground patrols to stay in their camps. After 3 days, the blizzard had subsided, and on February 12th, Alexander got a report that Albert Johnson had been sighted on the other side of the Richardson Mountains. He crossed an entire mountain range during a 3-day blizzard. What the heck? Albert Johnson was an incredibly skilled survivalist, one that was able to trick his pursuers time and time again. Even though his footprints were already hard to track because of the snow, Johnson doubled back on multiple occasions and even walked inside of caribou tracks to hide his trail. He crossed obstacles that shouldn't have been possible, miles of thorny bramble, an entire mountain range. He crossed a mountain range. Remember that? All of this while the average temperature was well below freezing. He was much too prepared for this. Even so, no one can live forever. On February 14th, Whop spotted Johnson's trail finally from above, in between Bell and Eagle River. Fog kept him from flying for 2 days, but in those 48 hours, Alexander Eames led a party of 11 armed men on Johnson's trail, and by the time Whop was airborne again, he saw the fugitive below. Johnson stood in the midst of a huge river of ice, watching as the RCMP officers closed in on him. At first, the fugitive tried to run, but realizing he would probably be shot down, he jumped to the ground using his backpack as a shield of sorts and readied his rifle. Alexander screamed for the trapper to finally give up, but the madman didn't listen. He began wildly firing shots into the troop, hitting a sergeant in the process. Whop flew over the battle and watched as Johnson took a hit to the shoulder and yet kept fighting. Alexander commanded the group to spread out, and as Johnson stood up, readying to fire once more, he looked around him. They had caught him in a crossfire. Surrounding him, the Mounties began firing shot after shot into Johnson. He was hit many times, and finally, one of the officers shot a bullet straight through his spine, finally killing him. One of the officers took this photo shortly after killing him. Yikes. Found in his backpack were 2,400 Canadian dollars, which today would be 51,000. What? He also had a bit of gold, including some teeth. Some golden teeth. Though he claimed to be Albert Johnson, no one could identify him, and his fingerprints didn't match anyone's in the Canadian or US police files. To this day, no one knows who the heck he was. Some say he might have been a criminal fleeing from the US, but he'd have to have been a good one because how would he know to survive the cold like that? While we don't know his motives, his life before this, or even his name, we know his legacy. He will forever be known as the Mad Trapper of Rat River. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll keep posting weekly. I don't really have much of an outro to say in this video. I'm just going to continue posting weekly. Hope you enjoy it. Maybe subscribe. Bye!